Susan is the opposite. She never wished to be famous, she wanted to be a singer, and she doesn't conform. She's just a normal person who thought this was her last.
There's a woman sitting alone in a quiet house in a small Scottish town right now, and most of the world has completely forgotten she exists. A woman who, not so long ago, had her name in every headline on the planet, whose voice made strangers weep in airports and office break rooms and living rooms from London to Tokyo. A woman who shattered every cruel assumption the entertainment industry ever built about age, appearance, and who deserves a second chance. And yet, things aren't looking good for Susan Boyle. Her health has been tested in ways she never saw coming. The spotlight that once followed her everywhere has moved on. And the question that her most devoted fans have been quietly asking for a while now is a painful one: is this really how her story ends? To understand where Susan Boyle is today, you have to go back to where she started, because her beginning is unlike almost anyone else who has ever stood on a stage and called themselves a performer. She was born in 1961 in Blackburn, West Lothian, a grey, post-industrial town in Scotland where the winters are long and the opportunities are few. From her very first moments of life, the world was not particularly kind to her. Doctors at the time made a significant error, telling her parents that she had suffered brain damage during birth due to a lack of oxygen. That misdiagnosis followed Susan through her childhood like a shadow she could never outrun. It shaped how teachers treated her, how other children saw her, and perhaps most devastatingly, how she was made to feel about herself during the years when a person's sense of worth is still being formed. School was not a safe place for Susan. She was bullied relentlessly, mocked for the way she looked and the way she moved through the world. Her quirks, which were later understood to be traits of Asperger's syndrome, made her a target in a community that had little patience for anything that fell outside a very narrow definition of normal. She has spoken in interviews about being physically tormented by classmates, being isolated, being made to feel like she was fundamentally broken. She left school without many qualifications and without much hope that the outside world would treat her any differently than her classmates had. Most people, after a childhood like that, would have quietly accepted the ceiling that society had placed over their heads. Susan never fully did, though she spent decades coming very close to it. What kept her from disappearing entirely was her voice. It had always been there, this extraordinary instrument that seemed to belong to a completely different life than the one she was living. She sang in her family's kitchen. She sang in her local Catholic church, where the congregation would sit up a little straighter when she began. She sang at karaoke nights in local pubs, earning the warm applause of people who maybe didn't fully understand what they were hearing but knew it was something special. Her mother, Bridget, was the one person in her life who never doubted her. Bridget pushed her daughter to believe in the voice even when Susan herself struggled to. She helped pay for a small demo recording when Susan was in her 20s, a modest attempt to get her foot in the door of an industry that never wrote back. The silence from record companies was total. The years passed in that quiet, insular way that they do in small towns. Susan's siblings grew up and moved into lives of their own, and gradually it was just the two of them, Susan and Bridget, in the modest council house on a street that most of the world would never have any reason to visit. Susan became her mother's primary caregiver as Bridget aged, and whatever private dreams Susan still carried, she tucked them away to focus on the person who had always looked after her. It was a life defined by duty, by love, and by a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself loudly but settles into the bones over time. In 2007, Bridget Boyle passed away at the age of 91. For Susan, the loss was not simply the death of a parent. It was the loss of the one relationship that had held her world together. The grief was immense and disorienting. She was 45 years old, living alone, surviving on government benefits, with no clear path forward and no one to tell her that the path was worth walking. Neighbors would check on her because people were genuinely worried about what the loss might do to her. But before Bridget died, Susan had made her a promise. A quiet, personal promise that she would finally do something with the voice her mother had always believed in. She would take a real chance. It took her 2 years to work up the courage to act on it. On a Saturday in April 2009, Susan Boyle walked onto the stage of Britain's Got Talent in Glasgow wearing a modest lace dress, carrying a fierce nervous energy, and chewing gum in a way that made the audience smirk before she had said a single word. She was 47 years old. She had never had a professional career. She had never been on television. And the room, without knowing a single thing about her except how she looked, had already decided what kind of person she was and what kind of performance she was about to give. The judges exchanged knowing glances. People in the audience rolled their eyes. The air in that auditorium was thick with the specific cruelty of a crowd that has gathered, at least in part, to watch someone fail. Then Susan opened her mouth and sang the opening lines of I Dreamed a Dream from Les Miserables, and within seconds, the entire room changed. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once. The smirks collapsed. The eye rolls stopped. The judges, who moments before had been performing their boredom for the cameras, sat forward in their chairs with expressions of genuine, disbelieving wonder. The voice that filled that auditorium was rich and powerful and emotionally devastating in the way that only a voice carrying real lived experience can be. It was not the voice of someone who had been manufactured by a talent agency or coached into polish by expensive training. It was the voice of someone who had been singing in church and in kitchens and in quiet moments of grief for 40 years, and who had finally, impossibly, found a room large enough to hold it. The standing ovation came before the song was even finished. People in the audience were crying. Amanda Holden, one of the judges, later said it was the single most powerful moment she had ever witnessed on that stage. Simon Cowell, who built his reputation on being impossible to impress, sat there looking genuinely moved. When the song ended, Susan seemed almost surprised by the reaction, as though she had not fully allowed herself to imagine that it would go this way. The judges gave her 3 unanimous yes votes and something rarer than that, a public acknowledgement that they had been wrong about her before she had sung a note, and that they were ashamed of it. The video of that audition reached the internet almost immediately, and what happened next was unlike anything the platform had seen at that point in its young history. Tens of millions of people watched it within days. Not because it was shocking in a sensational way, but because it was emotionally true in a way that very little content on the internet ever manages to be. It spread because people wanted to share the feeling it gave them. It spread because Susan Boyle, without trying to, had tapped into something universal, the fear of being overlooked, the hope that it is not too late, and the quiet belief that there might be something extraordinary hiding inside an ordinary life. What followed that audition was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable commercial stories in modern music history. Her debut album, released in late 2009, sold over 700,000 copies in the United States in its first week alone, debuting at number 1 on the Billboard charts. In the United Kingdom, it broke records for the fastest-selling debut album by a female artist. Over the following years, it went on to sell more than 10 million copies worldwide. Her second album matched and in some ways exceeded those achievements, earning her the distinction of being only the second act in history to reach number 1 on both the UK and US charts in the same 12-month period, placing her in company with the Beatles. For a woman who had been surviving on basic government assistance just months earlier, the numbers were staggering and, in many ways, completely surreal. But success on that scale does not come without a cost, and Susan's was significant and very human. The weeks between her audition and the live final of Britain's Got Talent were a pressure cooker that she was genuinely not equipped for. The media attention was aggressive and unrelenting. Photographers stationed themselves outside her home. International news outlets treated her daily movements as breaking news. She went from a person who spent most of her time alone with her cat to someone who could not walk down a street without being recognized, followed, and photographed. For most people, even experienced celebrities, that kind of sudden, total loss of privacy is destabilizing. For Susan, whose Asperger's syndrome made large crowds and unpredictable social environments particularly overwhelming, it was genuinely dangerous. She did not win the competition, finishing second to a street dance group called Diversity. And in the hours after the finale, with the cameras off and the adrenaline gone, the weight of everything that had happened in the preceding weeks caught up with her all at once. She was taken to a private psychiatric clinic in London where she spent several days recovering under medical supervision. The public reaction to that news was, to its credit, largely compassionate. People who had been consuming her story as entertainment suddenly confronted the reality that there was an actual human being at the center of it, one who had been pushed far past her limits by an industry and a media cycle that had not particularly paused to consider her well-being. She came back from it. She always came back from it. She recorded her albums, she went on tours, she performed for massive crowds around the world, she sang for the Pope and for the royal family, and she did it all while remaining, stubbornly and completely, the same woman from Blackburn who preferred her local grocery store to boutiques in Paris, who lived in the same council house she had grown up in rather than the luxury villa her team encouraged her to buy, and who kept her cats and her modest routine and her deep Catholic faith as the anchors of a life that had become almost unrecognizably large. The money changed her bank account. It did not change her. But then came April 2022, and the event that quietly reshaped the last several years of her life in ways that very few people outside her immediate circle fully understood at the time. Susan suffered a stroke. She was 60 years old, and the stroke affected the left side of her face and, in a cruel piece of timing that seemed almost too cruel to be real, it significantly damaged her ability to speak clearly. For a woman whose entire identity, whose promise to her mother, whose reason for getting out of bed each morning, was tied to her voice, the experience of losing access to it was devastating in a way that went far beyond physical. She kept it private for over a year, retreating from public view while she worked through an intensive rehabilitation process, relearning how to form words, rebuilding the muscular control needed to produce the notes she had been producing effortlessly for decades. When she returned to the Britain's Got Talent stage in June 2023 and sang again, she told the audience plainly that she had fought hard to be standing there. It was not a performance of resilience for the cameras. It was a genuine statement of fact from a woman who had spent the better part of a year doing the exhausting, unglamorous work of recovery in private rooms, with no audience and no applause, just the slow, grinding effort of rebuilding something she had almost lost. The comeback has not been a clean, triumphant arc. Recovery from a stroke is not linear, and the demands it places on a person's body and voice are significant and ongoing. Susan has continued with vocal coaching and physical therapy. She has made public appearances and spoken candidly about what the experience has been like. And in a move that genuinely surprised people who had followed her career, she has also been working on new music, collaborating with contemporary producers on material that sounds nothing like the slow, orchestral ballads that made her famous, leaning instead towards something more upbeat, more modern, and more unexpected. She also unveiled a dramatically different visual image, a sharp new look that signaled she was not interested in becoming a nostalgia act. But the truth, the honest truth that sits underneath all of it, is that things have been hard. The health battle was real and serious. The years of relative quiet were not entirely by choice. The Susan Boyle who first walked onto that stage was 47, and the Susan Boyle navigating this chapter of her life is 64, carrying the accumulated weight of an extraordinary and genuinely difficult journey. The music industry she broke into has changed almost beyond recognition. The streaming era rewards volume and youth and algorithm-friendly sounds, none of which are particularly natural fits for her. The massive commercial infrastructure that once surrounded her releases has largely moved on to other things. And yet, there is something about Susan Boyle that has always resisted the neat, tidy endings that the world tries to write for people like her. She was supposed to be a brief novelty in 2009. She was supposed to disappear after the breakdown. She was supposed to fade after the initial record-breaking sales. She was supposed to stay quiet after the stroke. She has declined every one of those supposedly inevitable endings with the same stubborn, unassuming determination that she has brought to everything else in her life. She made a promise to her mother in a small house in a small town, and she has been keeping it ever since in every way she knows how. Not because the industry rewarded her, not because the world made it easy, and not because the path was ever clear or safe or kind to her. But because the voice is still there, still carrying everything it has always carried, and because Susan Boyle has never once believed that a dream has an expiry date. Whether things are looking good or not, that has never been the part that mattered most to her.